Welcome to I Might Believe in Fairies. I am your host, Aaron Erber. This is a podcast about stories, myths, and the Catholic faith. Hey everybody, welcome to I Might Believe in Fairies. Today we have as a guest Thomas Salerno, and we're going to talk about superheroes, Marvel and DC, and the indie comics scene. And I'm going to let Thomas introduce himself.
Well, thanks for having me on, Aaron. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name's Thomas Salerno. I'm currently a freelance writer. Writing mostly nonfiction right now, having to do with, I like to say, the intersection of Christianity and nerd geek culture. So I write about comic books, sci-fi, fantasy, all that great stuff, which is actually kind of different from my academic background. I graduated in 2015 from Stony Brook University with a degree in anthropology, and my focus was in paleoanthropology, so the study of human and primate fossils. And I worked for almost 8 years, both first as a volunteer and then as a paid employee at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, where I worked as a fossil preparator and a collection assistant, working on both dinosaur and human fossils, because my other great passion is paleontology and dinosaurs and fossils and all that great stuff. And in fact, I do have plans to integrate some of my educational background into my writing. Maybe do a little more writing about dinosaurs and science, probably in 2022 as I make for my plans for next year. But yeah, I've been a comic book fan from pretty much since I was a kid. I've been a fan of these characters. I grew up on Batman the animated series and X-Men and Superman the animated series, and in high school, I actually started getting into the comics, kind of via the, I don't know if you remember these, but the publisher DK used to put out these big encyclopedias of Marvel and DC characters.
Oh, yeah.
And I used to get them out of the library near me, and I would read them from cover to cover. And so I kind of absorbed an encyclopedic knowledge of these characters, and then we didn't have a comic book shop near me when I was growing up, but when I was in high school, I was finally able to buy some comics in trade paperback collections, and then that's when I started reading these great characters, and I've just become fascinated with comics as kind of a modern mythology almost, and kind of like delving a little bit into my anthropological background of like, comics is kind of an expression of what I guess James Campbell would call the monomyth.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that we're just retelling these same kind of core stories over and over again, just with a different cast of characters. And so I like to delve into that, and to also the way it intersects with Christianity in my articles. It's been a lot of fun to do.
Cool. Yeah, I remember I grew up on those same shows too. The love of those characters was like, you know, I had that from a very young age, especially the Batman animated series. And we have all of them in the basement. You know, I bought them for my kids. They're a little too old, or my kids are a little too young still, because we tried watching Batman the animated series a few times. And I had to pick and choose the episodes because some of them are pretty scary, you know?
Very dark.
Very dark. Yeah, we like the ones with the Joker, you know, with Mark Hamill as the Joker, because he's hilarious. And they're surprisingly not that dark compared to, like, you know, the Scarecrow episodes or Clayface, you know, where the guy's face melts, you know. And so I'm trying to introduce these things to them but it's a little too early. So my oldest is only 4. I'm like, with my wife, I'm like, oh, I think I started watching these when I was like 8 or 9.
Yeah. I used to watch them when I got back from school, and I actually got to tell that to Kevin Conroy. I met him at New York Comic Con a few years ago.
Yeah.
And that, is one of the highlights of my life, just getting to meet the voice of Batman,
that's cool.
This character that I grew up on. And by the way, he's the most soft-spoken guy you'll ever meet.
Yeah.
He's nothing like his Batman persona, which I thought was funny.
Yeah, that's cool. So, what is it about these stories that really resonate with people? Because, we have all the movies and like all the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the whole interconnected, there's like 25, 26 movies now. We have the Netflix shows like Daredevil. It's one of my favorite modern shows. And if we could talk about Daredevil too, because there's a strong Catholic angle to that. But what do you think is it about these characters and these shows and comics that really resonate with people, and that really why are they so popular?
I think it must be something that's kind of deep in the human psyche, because it goes all the way back, I think, to like early myths. Because like essentially, like you read some of the Greek myths, and they read almost like superhero stories.
Mm-hmm.
You have these characters like Heracles and Perseus and Ajax and Jason, and they have these either incredible powers or they have a skill set that's really useful.
Yeah.
And they have all these crazy adventures, and they defeat monsters or evil people, or they get some treasure. And I just think that there's, I can't say what it is exactly, but I just think it must be something that's deep in the human psyche, that we're looking for heroic models
mm-hmm.
to aspire to. And of course, every culture has their own kind of take on what the heroic ideal should be.
Right.
But a lot of superheroes and a lot of heroic characters in general kind of conform to like very similar archetypes. And I've always thought it's interesting that we find just a lot of these archetypes common across cultures.
Yeah. Like it's seen as positive to be brave, or to go and fight the monster, get the treasure, rescue the beautiful princess, or whatever it is. And I heard, I don't know where I read this from, but the modern superheroes, not only are they kind of extensions of ancient stories, but they also have this kind of Christian gloss to them, because they've been kind of marinated in a more Christian culture, and the characters kind of act like Christians, but they have the powers of the ancient heroes like Hercules, and where Hercules, he'll fly into a blind rage and kill his family,
Yeah.
And Superman doesn't do that, right? Unless I guess Hercules was also kind of brainwashed by Hera during a dream or something like that, and he thought he was killing enemies, and it was his family and the whole town.
That's like something that would happen in modern comics, but we can get into that later.
Yeah, for sure. But like the original Superman, especially the early cartoons from like the 30s, they're very. I mean, he's good, right? He does good. He's not. They would never think of him necessarily flying into a rage and murdering a whole town. That comes later.
No, I would totally agree that, like, and I think I actually said this recently, either on another podcast or in some context. I had said that, like, the superhero stories are building on essentially the last 2,000 years of Christian culture.
Mm-hmm.
They're pulling from literature.
Right.
Which has just been, like you said, marinating in Christian culture. And a lot of comic book creators almost can't help but draw on biblical and Christian imagery, even if they don't know they're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's so ingrained, especially when those characters were created, right? So a lot of them are based off of like existing pulp characters, like Superman is Doc Samson, not Doc.
Yes.
Is it Doc Samson? Yeah. And Batman is what's his name?
Shadow.
The Shadow, thank you. The Shadow and Zorro, basically.
Yes,
And Batman explicitly models himself after Zorro because that was his childhood hero. And Superman is also based off of Moses.
Yes, I was going to get into that. Yeah.
So the heroes the creators were Jewish, I believe, who created Superman. and they explicitly modeled him after Moses. The infant son sent away from a dying world, basically, and raised by adopted parents. So if you wanted to continue on with that.
No, exactly. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were the creators of Superman, and I believe consciously, we're drawing on mosaic imagery with Superman. Of course, in a lot of modern Superman stories, they've overlaid also a lot of Christian imagery, because that's easy to do, right? Superman is a quote-unquote savior from somewhere else,
right?
Arrived and is kind of, showing us this better way that we can aspire to,
right? Well, he's like the exiled king, kind of,
Also, he's from a royal house, the house of El, like Christ is from the house of David.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. The El, that is that El mean El in ancient Hebrew means God,
right?
Or Elohim, it means God, or small g God. Which is they were explicitly doing that, right? They knew what they were doing when they were doing it.
Yeah.
So they were explicitly linking like Kal El, Jor El. It's really, really fascinating. And Batman, have you watched the Jonathan Pageau? Do you know him at all?
It's not ringing a bell, no.
Okay. So he does a lot of like symbolism stuff. And he has this great video on Batman that kind of explains why Batman is resonates with people so much. And you should check it out. We won't go into it now. But it has to do with the fall and losing, innocence, and having to put on death to fight death. And so that's why he dresses as a bat, which is fascinating.
I like that. Yeah, you'll have to send that to me.
Sure,
that sounds right up my alley.
Yeah. So these comics, we both kind of grew up reading them. I think I started reading them probably around the same time in like high school, starting to buy all the trade paperback, graphic novels, spending lots of money on them, trying to get them at used bookstores if I could, So we have Marvel and DC. There were others too, but they're the only two that kind of remain now in sort of like mainstream comic world. Do you read anything that they're putting out now, or have you stopped?
I've kind of stopped in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
I think the last kind of hurrah for me reading contemporary comics was when DC did their DC Rebirth initiative.
Okay. The New 52?
A few years ago.
Is that what that was?
It was after the New 52.
Oh, see, that's how long I started. I think I read the New 52 and then stopped.
A lot of people, including me, were very disappointed with the direction of the New 52.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just that they were ignoring previous continuity. It's that they were stepping on it. Like they were really like treating it like it didn't matter. And a lot of people had come up through the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s following these characters. Well, a friend of mine likes to say that superheroes are that superhero comics are kind of like male soap operas in a way, because we get so invested in the characters, and a lot of times in their familial relationships.
Right.
And to have those kind of wiped away. And in a lot of cases, the New 52 severely altered the personalities of a lot of characters.
Yeah, well, and I remember when they did the classic Green Lantern, like the one from the 40s, they made him gay, right? So
yes.
That was, even my dad, who's not very conservative, I mean, a little bit, but he was like, well, like, what's going on here? What's like... because you're right. You get invested in these characters, and you don't really want them to change. But one,
they've done that recently with two characters that I am a fan of:
mm-hmm.
Tim Drake, Robin, and Superman's son, John Kent.
Oh,
both of whom they have altered to be bisexual.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of creating new characters. They alter old characters in this way, and that kind of put me off. But even before that, it's just like, okay, so after the New 52, they bring in the Rebirth Initiative, which I was very excited for.
Mm-hmm.
And I read a lot of the Rebirth comics. I read the Rebirth one-shot where they bring back Wally West Flash,
oh, okay.
who they had essentially erased as a character, but they brought him back, and that was very emotional. But as Rebirth went on, they kind of showed that they weren't committed to this new direction. They went back to telling very dark, very depressing, very almost nihilistic, in my opinion, stories. And I just wasn't having it. Yeah. And I'm more of a DC guy because I grew up with the Batman animated series and its spin-offs, Superman, Justice League. So, by temperament, I'm more of a DC guy. And to see DC kind of lose, in my opinion, they're losing what makes those characters great.
Yeah.
Like I like to say that, and other people have said this, that the Marvel characters are the characters you identify with. Mm-hmm. Like but DC's characters are the ones who you look up to. Yeah. And you aspire to be like. They're supposed to be these paragons. They're almost quasi-mythological. And I'm like, to just see the DC universe lose that spark, that kind of optimism, that sense that we can aspire to greatness. And just in Marvel and DC in general, the constant event comic syndrome, where event after event after event. And for those who may not know, event comics are usually storylines that cross over most, if not all, of the titles that are running.
Yeah, and there's like 50 DC. Titles, Right. So if you want to know the whole story, you have to buy all the.
They shake up the status quo.
Yeah.
But the problem is that if you have no status quo to shake up,
right,
you can't, because you can't just constantly shake up the status quo over and over and over again.
Right.
And I feel like that they're using event comics to drive sales. Because they know that, like, even though the movies are mega popular, they're still not getting the sales numbers on the comics that they would like.
Oh no, they've been plummeting. I know that.
Yeah.
I told you about this before we started recording, and it kind of speaks to what you're talking about. So it's a book called From Star Wars Superman by James. I still don't know how to pronounce that. James Papanrea, Christ Figures in Science Fiction and Superhero Films, published by Sophia Press. There's a section in here on superheroes, and it's one of the last chapters, and they talk about how the author talks about how these stories they keep going, right? So they never really stop, and there's this constant cycle of death and rebirth, and it's very pagan. He said he loves these stories, so he's not like crapping all over them or anything, but he's kind of noticing that like that's this endless cycle of good guy fights bad guy, the evil is driven away for a time, then it comes back, and it's this never ending cycle. And he says it's almost an exercise in futility. And that's kind of built into the structure of these stories, right? Because like these characters are over 70, 80 years old now, and they keep going. And so they have this, I don't know what do you make of that?
I've often thought that they should address that some way in a story. And sometimes you'll read stories, whether as comics or as like animated series or movies, where characters will kind of talk about the problem of evil, and they'll say like, well, why do we keep fighting these bad guys if just more bad guys appear? Every time we knock one down, another one shows up.
That's he quotes Batman in that. I think it's from Batman The Dark Knight, I think, when he said fighting criminals is like pulling weeds. You pull one up and another one takes its place. It's just it's very nihilistic.
The funny thing is that they stop there and they don't follow that rabbit hole anywhere, because the way I thought of that, because I remember watching an animated series once where the characters directly address that. They say, "Why am I fighting if every time I knock down a bad guy, another one just appears later? And my thought was, well, you need to recognize that you, as this heroic figure, you're essentially a Band-Aid on the problem. You know, you can never be the Messiah.
Right.
You know, if someone crucifies you tomorrow, your death will not save the world and, you know, atone
You'll
for
just
sin.
Be dead. Yeah.
So, like, it's like, so the heroes are messianic figures to an extent, but they're not complete messianic figures.
Yeah.
And, like, it's important to recognize that superheroes and other, you know, characters of that nature are kind of Band-Aids on the problem. They could and should keep fighting evil, but they're never going to fix the fallen nature of the universe. That requires action from outside, you know, as we would say, you know, in the incarnation of Christ.
Well, I think it's another way that these stories kind of mirror the ancient pagan myths, right? Because a lot of these ancient stories, in many ways, were kind of awaiting the true Messiah.
Right.
You know, Hercules, as mighty as he is, he can't save the world from sin. You know, he can't defeat death, right? He can't defeat evil once and for all. And it's the same thing with these superhero stories. Since, I mean, it's even built into how they're written, right? So they're like, you go for a while, for like 5 years, and then you get all these crazy characters, and it just stops making sense after a while. That's why they have to like reboot it, you know, start the universe over, like a kind of like you know, those ancient pagan cycles, you know, that things just keep going and like, going and going.
And they need Ragnarok to reset everything, like the Norse gods, you know, like. Right. But yeah, and it's interesting you should mention, like, you know, that the old pagan heroes couldn't defeat death, because getting back to the monomyth for a second, a lot of, in ancient pagan mythologies, the hero will enter the underworld.
Yeah.
And he will either retrieve a person or some boon from the underworld.
Or barely escape himself or herself.
And barely escape himself, but he never defeats death. He never, you know, as it says in somewhere in the New Testament, you know, he shall put all his enemies under his feet. Right. Meaning Christ, and the last enemy to be destroyed is death. But like a lot of commentators have noticed that Christ is kind of the fulfillment of all of these myths, because, you know, the old idea of the hounding of the harrowing of hell. Yeah. Where, you know, Christ enters Sheol, he enters the underworld and releases all of the just, the patriarchs, the prophets, all the people, the good people over the centuries who have, you know, been awaiting his coming, and they're allowed to enter paradise. So it's like Christ is the definitive hero who enters the underworld and releases the captives and all that stuff. And you see it too in superhero comics and even in fantasy. You know, like in my favorite example is Lord of the Rings, where Aragorn descends into the underworld and retrieves that army of the dead to fight for him. So that kind of imagery is just repeated throughout cultures, and it's almost on a subconscious level, right? You know, which I just find fascinating. But yeah, like these heroes are pointing us toward something greater. But I think a lot of our culture just gets stuck looking at them and doesn't look any higher.
Right. And then modern, like a lot of the modern comics, in the last few years, I think when Disney bought Marvel, that's when things really started to go. It's funny, when Disney bought Marvel, I was not yet, I hadn't come back to the church, so, or maybe I had, and I don't know, I can't remember, but I don't remember when it was. But I was like, oh, cool. So Disney now owns like everything. I thought it was a good thing. And now I'm like, oh no, that was probably a really bad idea, because now Disney controls the stories, and I don't really like Disney all that much. So Disney's fine. I don't know. Like, all of the movies are pretty good, but like, but what do you think? So like, a lot of the stories now are very, very dark, or completely in clown world, I guess, as some people say, where good is bad or bad is good, and they're really preachy with like a lot of progressive talking points. And so, or they take characters and subvert them.
Right.
And like I remember when Captain America, I'd never read this comic, but they said, oh, he's a Nazi. Actually, the whole time he's been a Nazi, right? So, or not a Hydra. He's been an agent of Hydra.
Yeah. Oh, they tried to hand wave that away.
Yeah, because people were pissed, man. Like they're
right, because they were like, oh, America? He was really like, it was some. I didn't read it, so I don't know the details.
Yeah, I didn't read it either.
Apparently, there was some kind of mind control involved, or he was replaced by an alternate reality version. It had something to do with the cosmic cube, like well,
what you were saying about it's a male soap opera, right? All these crazy things, like he was my half brother's evil twin or something,
Right? Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, it just kind of clicked right now.
Like comics have always spoke to the political landscape. I mean, especially if you go back and read some of the letters to the editor that Stan Lee would answer, where people back then would complain, oh, you're being too political. And he would say, like, well, of course I am. I have to comment on the culture that's around me. Art usually does that. Mm-hmm. The problem is that now it's just one voice.
Yeah.
There's no kind of, I don't know, would you say ideological spectrum? I don't know. It's just like that they're all in lockstep promoting the general kind of progressive milieu ideology that's dominant in the culture, from Hollywood to, politics to the media to all this stuff. And it can alienate readers.
Just normal people who want a story and not to be lectured,
Well, yeah, and that's the problem, too, is that they either lecture, whereas, like, that the characters will just essentially break the fourth wall and tell the audience, like the old G.I. Joe thing, and knowing is half the battle, right? Like, or it will just be kind of in your face, and they will have characters whose sole function is to make some kind of moral point, or to fill in. They're essentially kind of roster,
it's like a box checking, like
right. And everyone is so focused on identity these days that they forget to build an interesting character.
Right.
Whereas the character, like they create these cardboard characters that are just stereotypes based on their ideas of identity and what specific identities should be like, and it hurts the bad guys too. Like. I don't want to get too much into this, but I remember there was a recent controversy where Marvel essentially had the Red Skull quoting Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up.
Yeah, as if
clean your room,
Which, well, the thing is, it actually takes away, it does violence to the character of the Red Skull,
right? Who
is a Nazi. He should be he should be spouting Nazi ideology, not, it turns that character into a joke, essentially.
Yeah, basically,
But they don't care because they've essentially equated, like, anything right of center as anathema.
Yeah, I think that was Ta-Nehisi Coates who wrote that one.
It was, yeah.
I have not heard anything from
You see this, and it just alienates readers, and I don't see how they think sales are going to improve this way.
Well, it might not be about sales, unfortunately. If it were about sales, they'd probably avoid this kind of stuff. But
I've actually been going back and trying to read some of the older stuff that I missed.
Yeah.
That was before me. I really want to read through the classic Spider-Man. Like the early Spider-Man comics. I want to read through the classic Incredible Hulk. Because I'm becoming more fascinated with the Hulk as a character, especially his early appearances. As someone who actually does kind of struggle with, anger.
Yeah.
As an issue. It's funny, one of my first jobs that I had, my hair trigger temper was actually so noticeable that one of my coworkers nicknamed me Dr. Banner. So
oh man.
But in any case, like, yeah, it's like I want to go back and read these kind of classic stories because a lot of the contemporary stuff just isn't doing it for me.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of it's just a lot of it's boring. You know, they're not interesting stories anymore. I mean, I haven't read a contemporary comic and I don't even know.
I've had a lot of fun with the crossovers that have been happening, especially with the Ninja Turtles.
Oh, yeah.
They have had some amazing crossovers. TMNT Batman is some of the most fun I've had reading comics. TMNT Ghostbusters is also amazing. And TMNT Power Rangers. TMNT Power Rangers may have been the most fun I've had reading a comic in years. Because that made me feel like I was 8 years old.
Who publishes that?
Oh, TMNT Power Rangers. I think was IDW and Boom Studios collaboration.
Okay, cool.
But that made me feel like an 8-year-old again. I had so much fun with that. And that's the kind of stories I want. Just bonkers, off the wall fun. Because the comic books is a medium where you can do so many crazy things, like we were talking about.
Right.
So many just insane stuff. That's why I actually think, and this might be a controversial opinion, but out of the DCEU movies, you know, like Man of Steel, Batman vs. Superman, all those, the one that was my favorite was Aquaman.
Really?
Yes, because that one felt most like what I think a comic book movie should be.
Yeah.
It was big. It was loud. It had fun characters. It had all this crazy stuff, all these Atlantean factions and all this crazy technology. And yeah, so it's just like, just give me something that surprises me, that makes me feel energized and excited to be reading this. Where nowadays, like we've been talking about, they've produced a lot of dour and depressing stories. You know, where it's like, no, that's not why I read comics.
Right. I don't want to be depressed. So I'm kind of looking at you have a website, and I'll put it in the show notes. And you write a lot of articles for Word on Fire, Catholic Ministries. It's Bishop Barron's. It's Bishop Barron's thing, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yep. And then Voyage Comics, and then a few others too. Like I've read. Is it Aleteia? Is that how you pronounce it? I
pronounce it Aleteia.
Aleteia.
Everyone seems to pronounce it differently.
Yeah, I've read a lot of their stuff. They're good. But you read a lot for Voyage Comics, and why don't you tell me what your role is for them and what they're all about, and how you got involved with them?
Yeah, so Voyage Comics is a small Catholic owned and operated comic book company run by my friend Philip Kozlowski. And it's funny because that was actually my first published article was on their blog.
Yeah.
It was on Voyage Comics blog. That was back in February of 2020.
And what did you write about? Which one was
that? That was about it was about Captain America. Specifically, it was the Jeff Loeb story, Captain America White, which was part of his color series, like Spider-Man Blue, Daredevil Yellow. And Captain America White was a period piece. It was set in World War II, and it was about exploring his sort of big brother relationship with Bucky.
Okay.
And because all those stories in that series, Spider-Man, Daredevil, Captain America, those color series focused on relationships, but the Captain America one, instead of focusing on a romantic relationship, focused on a platonic relationship.
Okay.
And I thought it was interesting to explore that because so much of the time now when they write relationships in comics, it has to be sexualized. They focus it on romantic relationships. And I'm like, and they're almost afraid to have characters be friends without being romantically involved in some way.
Right.
And it's like, no, you can have these two, men. Okay, one's a teenager, one is like in his mid-20s maybe, who are friends, who are like brothers. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to explore that relationship and commend Jeff Loeb for writing it that way.
Yeah, Jeff Loeb is good. I've always liked Jeff Loeb. So, yeah, you've written a lot for Voyage Comics, and
Yes.
are you mostly do you just write articles for them on their blog? You have quite a few, it looks like.
Yeah, I'm actually basically contributing to their blog once a month.
Okay.
And I've written a lot about superheroes. I've also written a lot about sci-fi. I've contributed articles about Star Wars and Star Trek, Tolkien, all that great stuff. And in fact, also in last year, or no, is it this year? 2021, right? Yes. The pandemic has messed up my conception of time.
It's everybody. Yeah. It's
yeah. I've also I've story edited a couple of their comics.
Oh, cool.
Which has been really exciting. Both issue 5 of Finnian and the Seven Mountains, which is a really cool historical fantasy comic book. Yeah. Which is great because everyone just thinks comic books, superheroes. They just equate it with superheroes.
Right.
But comic books, it's less of a genre and more of a storytelling medium. And you can tell all kinds of stories with comic books, and including fantasy and sci-fi and slice of life, basically anything you want. And so Finnian and the Seven Mountains is a historical fantasy having to do with the monks who actually lived on a Skellig Michael, the island that was Luke Skywalker's island in the recent Star Wars movies. Because that was actually, it had a medieval monastery there.
Yeah.
And so the comic follows this young man who discovers a map that's going to lead him to the legendary Sword of St. Michael. And the sword is in pieces.
Oh, cool.
And so as the story goes on, he is dogged by both enemies seen and unseen, evil Vikings as well as more supernatural enemies.
Cool.
And so I got to story edit issue 5, and I also helped to edit issue 1 of The Phantom Phoenix, which is their other big new title, which is a noir crime fighter superhero story about an African-American World War I veteran in the 1920s. He's disabled and is homeless, but he's actually also a crime fighter.
Yeah, I saw really that. Yeah. Cool. The art looks really good for both of those comics. And
they do such a good job. They hire professional artists working in the industry.
That's awesome.
Who've done work for Marvel and
because they're really good. Like they're really. That's what gets it for me. Is it's with a comic book. It's not just the story; it's the art too. Like that's like more important in many ways, or at least as important. Like if the art is bad, you don't want to read it, right? That's.
Right.
But the art for both of those looks really good. And I like the noir sort of setting for the Phantom Phoenix. That looks pretty cool. I have not read either one. But
the cool thing about the Phantom Phoenix is that he's also integrating some of the characters from the G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown stories.
Oh, really?
Including one of the villains
cool.
From those stories makes an appearance. And I actually got to write some of that villain's dialogue. And I love writing villain dialogue because I like to be very over the top with some of the villain dialogue. I love a good villain speech. And so...
That's cool. So what do you think is the role of stories for a Christian, I guess, for a Catholic? I'm going to leave that open. That's very broad. But
in terms of reading or writing stories?
Well, in terms of, I guess in terms of both of those, reading mostly, creating art, and what role they play in our own faith life, I suppose. I don't know. Something like that.
Yeah, and I know, I think, the two of us have kind of been following this kind of ongoing debate on Twitter about, can mythology, and storytelling help someone grow in the faith. And there's this idea that it helps kind of prime the imagination.
Yeah. That's my position, I guess. That's why I have this show.
I think there's truth in that, because to use the imagination, to think about other worlds, I guess, kind of primes us to think in terms of there's more to the universe than what we can see and measure.
Yeah.
Right? Because and we're both from scientific backgrounds, so we know the danger of scientism,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where it's just like, nope, all that exists is what I can measure and look at under a microscope or, see in a mass spectrometer or something like that.
Right.
But no, and I talked a bit about this in the recent podcast I did about Ray Bradbury's work, where his fiction, where there's this sense of just, that there's another world kind of just under the surface, that even the most mundane things in ordinary life
mm-hmm.
have a spiritual dimension to them.
Yeah.
Or, represent something that's much higher. I don't want to make it sound too much like it's like Platonic forms or something like that. But
mm-hmm.
But yeah, I just think that fiction helps prime the mind to think in terms of this world of matter and energy is not all there is.
Yeah.
That it's contained within a much higher world, because everything we deal with is contingent, right?
Right.
And there has to be a ground for that contingency. And that sometimes, the supernatural can kind of break into ordinary life
mm-hmm.
and disrupt it. And I think that, that doesn't happen in a kind of miraculous way.
Yeah.
To everybody. But you can encounter those kinds of things in fiction. And I think fiction is just kind of a non-threatening way. Because, it's easy for people to just get their guard up immediately. If they're steeped in kind of secularism and scientism, it's easy for people to just, as soon as you start mentioning the supernatural or God or angels or miracles, they just put up a barrier,
right?
Between you. I think, too, it can be a good discussion piece for evangelization. Because okay, when I was in college, a lot of my friends were either atheists or agnostic.
Yep.
In the program, obviously.
Are you a cradle Catholic? Or are you a convert? Or?
Yes, I'm a cradle Catholic.
Okay.
Yeah, and a lot of my friends had probably been raised in a Christian context, but now that they were in college, were either atheists or agnostics or just non-practicing.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them, like me, were fans of Lord of the Rings. But a lot of them didn't know about the very rich Christian and specifically Catholic imagery that was in the Lord of the Rings. And I used to use that as just a way to talk to people about it.
Yeah.
They're like, look, here's all this amazing stuff. Did you know this? And they'd be like, no, really? And it was just an interesting way to kind of plant that seed.
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to quote unquote convert them of anything.
Right.
But just to plant that seed of look, Catholic Christianity has influenced the last 2,000 years of art and is still doing it.
Right.
In contemporary literature.
Right.
And that's what I try to do in all my articles is look for those, Bishop Aaron likes to call them seeds of the gospel.
Right.
In popular culture. And I really think a lot of comic book writers do it without noticing it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you grow up in that environment, you kind of just, take stuff in. I'm like a lot of the Jewish writers who wrote these stories. Many of them, I don't know if they were observant, Jews or not, but they knew the legends, they knew the stories, and they incorporated them subconsciously or explicitly into their creations. And the same with the Catholic writers too. I know Mike Mignola, creator of Hellboy. He was raised Catholic, and he's unfortunately fallen away from the faith. But his faith still, he draws on the legends and on the kind of the mythic quality of it, and incorporates that into his storytelling along with other pagan myths and stuff like that to make really interesting stories. But yeah, I always found. Recently, I haven't been giving people, when I want to talk to somebody about the faith or whatever, I usually don't give them Scott Hahn books. I usually don't give them explicitly Catholic books. What I usually do is give them Lord of the Rings or something,
Right.
Or give them an author that I really like Gene Wolfe or somebody. Like, just to, here, just read this and just enjoy the beautiful aspects of it. And I won't even tell you they're Catholic, really, a lot of the time. I'll just tell you to read them. Because sometimes if you say, oh yeah, they're Catholic, they won't want to read it, right? So it's kind of a dangerous, this podcast I'm doing is kind of dangerous because I want to draw attention to these Catholic artists, but I also like don't want to alienate them and put them in a box of like, these guys are Catholic, right? And that's what they are. And then people will just kind of pigeonhole them into a little political category or whatever. And I don't really want to do that, but at the same time, you can't like not talk about it because, it's kind of a dangerous game to play, but I don't know. So I haven't been like, I want to, if people are interested, I'll give them a Scott Hahn book or whatever,
Right.
But if they don't, if I know they're not going to read it, if I know they're never going to read something like that, at least right away, I'm like, well, I'll give you Lord of the Rings, and I'll at least give you something really beautiful to read. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Where it's like, a lot of people, I've heard that, some of the best-selling classical albums right now are Gregorian chant.
Yeah.
Among people who are, secular or non-religious.
I had this conversation today a little bit. I was talking to my mother-in-law was talking about Gregorian chant, and I'm like, oh, maybe I'll go buy a Halo album or something, like the video games Halo, because they have a lot of Gregorian like kind of chant. I don't know if it's specifically Gregorian chant, but they have a lot of like chanting music, and a ton of people love that. Like the music, everybody talks about the music in Halo and how it's so beautiful, right? Like people really, really love that stuff.
Oh, I love the soundtrack of the Elder Scrolls games. Yeah. Even though I've never played them.
Oh, really?
I've never played them, but I love listening to the soundtracks.
Yeah.
They're just incredible.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. Skyrim it's great. It's a great game. I haven't played it in a while, but the music is really good. And the mythology in that game too is cool. I like it a lot.
So, I do know a bit about the mythology because I'm that kind of person who, even if I've never played a game or a series, I will go onto the wiki and start looking up all the mythology behind it.
Yeah.
And stuff. Because I love lore. I'm one of those people who loves the lore behind the universe. I have so many of those like Star Wars books that talk about all the details behind all the technology of the ships and the locations and stuff. I love worlds that, like Tolkien's, are kind of fully realized worlds. They're fleshed out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's another thing where it just goes so much beyond just mere storytelling. It becomes creating a world. And to bring it back to comics, I think that's one of the reasons why, we mentioned the New 52, especially why that alienated so many DC readers.
Yeah,
was that they felt that the people running DC did not care about the world. Now, of course, they've been doing the wipe the slate clean reboot since, Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Right. That's what started it, I think, right?
People were upset by that. But the New 52
at least the Crisis storyline was pretty epic, like I've read that
exactly.
one. It's pretty
and they showed
cool.
that like they cared about the characters who were either being let go or being merged into other characters.
Was that Wally West's last appearance as the Flash, or was that Barry Allen?
It was Barry Allen's last appearance for a while before Flashpoint, I think.
Okay.
No, Flash Rebirth.
Okay.
Flash Rebirth, Barry Allen comes back, and then Flashpoint kind of resets. That worked into like the coming of the New 52, essentially.
Yeah.
But it's like people thought that like, oh, you do not care about these legacy characters. You do not care about this universe.
Mm-hmm. Well, it just kind of is that it's that not only are they, they have their own motivations, the people who kind of control these intellectual properties, but it's the nature of this kind of storytelling process of these superheroes specifically is that since there's no like end point, there's no like time where Batman is going, unless in the Nolan films where he retires, right?
That's why I love the Nolan films.
See, I didn't like that about it.
There's a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah, that's true.
I thought that was so subversive.
I like
they didn't leave it open-ended.
Yeah, it's like no, he's done. He gets his happy ending, and that is good. That is good. I just love the old man Batman, like from The Dark Knight Returns, where he's just this grizzled old man who has to come out of retirement and become Batman again, you know,
Yes.
and that's what I really like. So, but with these stories, the reason they have to reboot them, and I'm just kind of thinking of this as we're kind of talking, is because there's no end, and so things get too crazy, and they have to reboot it and start everything new. And when you do that, then they have that chance to, okay, now we can reset everything. Now we can twist these characters into whatever shape we want, you know, and the audience can, you know, go jump off a bridge or whatever. You know, it doesn't matter what the audience wants.
The thing is that they also have Elseworld stories.
Yeah.
And usually, if they really want to reshape the character into something wildly different, they'll leave that to an Elseworld story. And a lot of those Elseworld stories are really top-notch stories.
They're good. Yeah, I like a lot of them. Mm-hmm.
You know, like I love most of DC's Earth One line.
Yeah. Well,
like
you have an article
Earth One is one of my favorite Superman stories.
Well, you have an article on Earth One, I think, right?
On Superman Earth One.
There it is. Yeah.
I love that story.
Yeah, talk about that one in your article, and because I read your article, but I think it was like last week. So.
Okay. Yeah. So Superman Earth One is basically retelling his origin, and it's like they do kind of a classic coming of age thing, and I really identified with Clark in this story because they make him a young man in I think his mid-20s. He's fresh out of college, but he doesn't know what to do with himself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and he has all these talents and these abilities, and he's just kind of lost. And it's funny, his parents, his Earth parents, were kind of pushing him to kind of embrace what makes him different and to perhaps be a superhero.
Mm-hmm.
To help the downtrodden. But he kind of pushes that away. And he's like, no, I want to live a normal life. I want to fit in. You know? And I kind of connect that in the article to the parable of the talents that Jesus tells, in which, you know, there's a rich man going away and he gives his money to several servants, and the wise ones invest it, but the foolish one buries it in the ground and it doesn't make any interest. And he gives it back to his master when he returns, and he's like, here's your money. And the master's like, no, you will be punished because you have not, you know, used this talent. Of course, back then, talent was like an insane amount of money.
Yeah.
It was, I think 800 pounds of silver or something. Or was it 80? I can't remember, but it's an insane amount of money.
Yeah.
And that sort of evolved into our word in English, talent, meaning a skill or, you know, a gift that you have.
Yeah.
And so Clark is kind of suppressing his natural gifts to try and lead this normal life. But he's not completely running away. It's interesting because he also wants to help the downtrodden in some way. But he's so afraid of rejection, of people knowing who he really is, an alien from outer space with these powers, that he doesn't want to put that into the open. But events eventually force his hand, because aliens end up coming to Earth, and they issue an ultimatum. We want the last son of Krypton, or we're going to destroy this planet.
Yeah.
And so he's kind of forced into revealing himself. But in doing that, he embraces who he truly is.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of, you know, he discovers his true self in his vocation, in his mission as Superman, in serving other people. And that's really subversive today, because a lot of self-help books will tell you, oh, you must be yourself. You must do all this navel gazing, in other words, to discover who you truly are. But Superman discovers who he truly is in service, in mission, in helping other people, in not focusing so much on himself and his problems.
Right.
And so those are the kind of themes I tried to explore. And then that was written by J. Michael Straczynski, wrote that story.
Okay.
He's famously the writer of the sci-fi television series Babylon 5.
That's what it is. Okay.
He's a really good writer.
Yeah.
And it's funny, he is not a religious person.
Right.
In fact, I think he's come out and said some pretty anti-religious things. But again, he can't help including these kind of biblical allusions.
Right.
in his story.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of these guys grew up Catholic, and they fall away, right? So they, which is really a shame. But they have these stories like kind of just in their imagination, and whenever they write something, it kind of just plays out that way. I don't think people could write a truly pagan story necessarily, without. I think I get on social media, I give George R. R. Martin a hard time. But I think one of the theories is why he hasn't finished Game of Thrones. This whole series is every time. I mean, the show. I never watched the show. I watched like one episode of it, and I was like, no, this isn't for me. But the show, I guess the last episode, the last season, people really didn't like it. I don't know why. And so because of the backlash on that, and because whenever he's trying to write something, one person said he catches himself writing something heroic, right? Or something like where grace kind of breaks in and the supernatural, all these things, all these good things kind of start happening, and he tries to put a stop to that, right, in his writing. So he writes himself into a corner, and that's why he hasn't finished the last one. I don't know. There's a lot of theories as to why he hasn't finished, but I think it's plausible. He's writing, and subconsciously he wants to, have the good guys win in the end, or whatever, and instead of just randomly killing off people. And I've read the first 2 books, so I know a little bit about the series, but yeah, I don't know. I think he's overrated. I think he's a good. I think his characters are interesting. I think he's got some skill as a writer, but I don't know. It's just not. There's a reason why it's popular. I just don't like
that everyone feels like they need to imitate him.
Well, I don't like all the incest. No,
well, no, but I mean, like his Game of Thrones has spawned so many imitators in the fantasy world now. You go to any bookstore and you pick up any random fantasy book off the shelf, and you read what's written on the dust jacket, and you're like, well, this is just Game of Thrones again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
it's this sort of like, I know
all
some
the
people,
Tolkien imitators in the 80s and 90s.
Terry Brooks and but yeah, it's the same thing with comics too, where this kind of nihilism has sort of crept in, and this sort of like weariness of the characters. They don't want to, when things are, they get twisted into something else, or the characters themselves are disillusioned, right? That was a big thing in the 90s, where it's like all the gritty anti-hero stuff, where they're like really disillusioned, they don't know, and it really tracks with the culture, right? Like you were saying earlier, like these comics really mirror what's going on in the culture, and are the comics affecting the culture, or is the culture affecting the comics, or
I really think it's like a feedback.
Yeah.
That the culture influences what is portrayed on the page and in film, and that just makes those things more socially acceptable.
Yeah.
So it's like this sort of feedback, and it's such a shame because, okay, I'm not a parent. I don't have kids.
Mm-hmm.
But I often think, like, if I had kids and they were into comics, would I let them read contemporary comics? And that's a hard question.
Yeah, I'd probably say no, not the modern. I would tell them avoid anything published in the last 8 years. Like just anything before Disney bought.
Right, like give them the classic stuff, or show them those old animated series, which are because it's like a lot of, and even comics that are like supposedly rated all ages can be problematic.
Yeah. Well, they're either subversive or they're so shallow they're nothing. They're just nothing stories, right?
Right.
Which I also have a problem with. So I'm like, at least the subversive stuff, there's something there, like it's not good, but like at least it's not nothing, No,
yeah, I read some all ages Star Wars comics last year, and I just got a few issues on a lark. And I read them, and I was like, these stories are nothing. They're so empty.
Yeah.
Nothing happens.
Right.
And I'm like, and even when it does happen, it's all resolved very quickly, and, there's no real story there.
Right.
And yeah, I just think that they're not holding themselves to a high standard anymore. And in especially in comic books, even the art, there's been some exposés done by people on YouTube.
Yeah.
About how a lot of the artists for the current Marvel Star Wars comics have been stealing fan art.
Oh, no.
Have been straight up tracing and inserting fan art, and it's like, okay, sometimes you don't want to blame the artist because there's some sort of editorial mandate. You've got to do it on this crazy deadline or whatever. But it's still not right. That is still plagiarism.
Right.
And, have been stealing fan art and fan designs for ships. And so in the writing and the art, they're not holding themselves to high standards. And that's why, I like the guys at Voyage Comics.
Yeah.
Because they really put a lot of care into all their projects. And as a small team, they can do that.
Right.
I really think, with the indie comic scene is probably more vibrant now than it's been probably ever. I mean, with crowdfunding sites. So but even those, with a lot of them, too, you have to be careful, because some of them, will publish things that, they couldn't get away with in mainstream comics because they're, too explicit.
Yeah, right. So, yeah. It's
oh,
go ahead.
But yeah, it's just I really respect those people who go out, on the indie route because, I feel like DC and Marvel especially are kind of so set in their ways right now.
Yeah.
That, the way they're telling stories, they are not going to change anytime soon. And because both of them are now owned by giant mega corporations,
right,
they're never going to go out of business.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So they don't have to worry about it.
They just keep producing stuff and people will keep consuming it. I mean, that...
That's in a kind
not
of
really,
race
though. Their sales are going down like crazy. Where now, I've read that manga, is outselling American comics in places like Barnes and Noble.
Right? Yeah. And, man, I wish manga weren't also problematic in many ways.
Yeah, there are issues with that too.
But
different issues in some ways. But what other indie comic? There's Voyage Comics, and what other indie comics do you like that you would recommend people?
Oh, yeah. There is a great series put out by a company called Terminus Media, I think. Dominion, Fall of the House of Saul.
Oh, okay.
And that is a comic that is essentially a retelling of the books of Samuel from the Bible. But it is a space opera.
Oh, cool.
And the characters are all anthropomorphic animals. So the creators like to describe it as Narnia meets Star Wars. And it's kind of like that in the sense that there are talking animals and it is set in outer space. But it's just a great retelling of the story of Saul and, David and kind of Saul's descent into jealousy and madness.
Yeah.
For David and stuff. The art is great. There's a lot of cool... If you love outer space stuff, you're going to like it. And to just see that story kind of transplanted into outer space is really cool. Cool.
And then do you write fiction yourself?
Yeah, actually. And in fact, I kind of want to make 2022 the kind of year of fiction. Mm-hmm. I'd like to really start focusing more on that. I've written a few short stories. None of them have been published anywhere. Mm-hmm. But I've gotten good feedback from beta readers. I'm really influenced a lot by Ray Bradbury. Yeah. As I've spoken about his kind of weaving the supernatural into sci-fi is something that I'm really interested in. Also, I have this really big dream to write a fantasy novel, and I've been working with a creative consultant on that to kind of iron out some of the world building issues that I've been hung up on. Mm-hmm. And and also I do have this really crazy idea for a comic book that would be a sci-fi action romance. And I don't know if I'll ever write this. Yeah. But I had the idea years ago. And it's kind of based on those old like planetary stories like John Carter of Mars.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But I kind of subvert some of the classic tropes.
Oh, okay.
Of those, and kind of make it more fresh and new without completely rejecting the older stuff.
Okay.
Kind of updating some of the problematic elements of those old stories, and I just want to do something that's really fun and bombastic and out there.
Yeah.
Like I'm no artist, so like I would have to find partners who are willing to do the art and the lettering, all the work that goes into a comic book is just massive. Like you almost need like the giant apparatus that Marvel and DC have, but
right.
But yeah, so no, I really want to get into writing more fiction. I love fiction. It's kind of like my first love when it comes to writing.
Yeah, that's great. Well, good luck with that. That sounds awesome, and we need more Catholic writers. I've enjoyed your nonfiction articles as well. So I kind of want to talk about Ray Bradbury a little bit because I really like Ray Bradbury. So what about his writing what about it really speaks to you? And because I remember he has this way to make nostalgic things like horrific,
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so like he'll paint this like in the Martian Chronicles, the Martians will recreate. I think it was in Kansas, it was like Kentucky or something like that, where the Earth astronauts land and like, oh, this looks like home, and like, oh, there's mom and dad, and it's like they have this beautiful dinner, and like, and then they get eaten or they get killed by the Martians.
Yeah.
And it's just this horrific scene, where they're realizing this is not our home, and it's, yeah, that's what I really like about Bradbury. I don't know, what do you really like about his work?
Yeah, Bradbury was a huge influence on the Twilight Zone, as you can probably tell, because a lot of his stories seem like they're lost episodes of the Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just love the way he's able to, like I said, kind of weave the supernatural into sci-fi in a way that none of his contemporaries were really interested in doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like everybody smushes Bradbury in between Asimov and Clarke as like the ABCs of science fiction.
Yeah.
But he's really nothing like either of those two guys. Those Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke were more of like the grandfathers of like hard science fiction.
Right.
Where Ray Bradbury, I kind of think he's like the progenitor of, I guess, what today we would call magical realism.
Yeah,
where like because even like in a lot of his story in his novels, Something Wicked This Way Comes, or in a lot of his stories that are set in suburbia, he's able to weave the kind of odd and supernatural and sometimes quite sinister supernatural elements into everyday life. And I just like how in his stories, the supernatural, whether for good or for ill, breaks into a character's life and just upends it.
Yeah, right.
And the characters have to just confront this just sense of otherness, of dealing with the supernatural, whether it's they suddenly time travel for no reason, or like,
right.
They encounter, some strange entity or a Martian, or like, and a lot of his stories are open-ended.
Yeah.
And I think that might strike some people as not satisfying, but for me, it just causes me more to think and speculate. What was that?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, what was that ending? And like, I start to like theorize and do all this cool stuff.
Yeah.
So I just love how he doesn't explain everything to you.
Right.
He respects the readers enough to draw their own conclusions, and he doesn't over-explain things, which is funny because I said earlier that I'm a lore guy. Mm-hmm. I love having explanations to things in fiction, but at the same time, I just find what Ray Bradbury did such a breath of fresh air. They're like, oh, he's not going to explain this.
Right.
He respects me enough to draw my own conclusions, and I just think that's so novel. Like even today, like there's a tendency even in fantasy to have magic systems. to systematize magic.
I've gone on about magic systems in another episode.
Where it's like, it's like no one is willing to just have the magic just be other, some thing that is not, that there are no like encyclopedic rules to. Right. It's like you don't have to explain it because then you just get midi-chlorians, right? It's like what is the force? Oh, it's an energy field created by all living things. Great, that's all I need to know. Right. Oh no, didn't you know it's these little microbes in your blood and you have a midi-chlorian count and all that stuff? And I'm like, no, and
Jedi have a higher midi-chlorian count than most people. That's why they can use the Force, or whatever. It's like, it's ridiculous. Right. Yeah, it's really dumb. Yeah.
It's like, don't explain. I don't need, So I just feel that he is very effective in doing that. And especially, the thing you need to know about Ray Bradbury is that if you read his stories at face value, you're going to miss something. Mm-hmm. And even me, when I read a lot of his stories the first time, I was like, what was that? I was just totally unsatisfied. But once I started to think about them more, I'm like, oh, I see what he's doing. He's conveying a metaphor. A lot of his stories are usually not about what they appear to be on the surface. Yeah. They're usually about life or death or grief or other strong emotions, growing up, getting old. Once you realize that, it's like a key to all his work. Right. And, you can read his stories in a different light and go, wow, he's actually saying something very interesting.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, Bradbury's great. That was a fun tangent. But we'll have to. Well, I'll have to familiarize myself more with him and have you back on to talk about specific stories. But yeah, so anything else you want to talk about as far as comics go? Marvel, DC, or any indie comics that you've written about that you wanted to talk about, an article you wrote, anything like that?
Oh, I think I would just want to touch on the article I wrote for Voyage Comics about my favorite Batman story arc of all time, Batman No Man's Land. Mm-hmm. And that was actually the first comics in trade paperback form that I read when I was a teenager. I bought Volume 1 of Batman No Man's Land from Borders when it still existed. The bookstore.
Oh, Borders, yeah.
Yeah. And they had a comic section, and so I picked up Batman No Man's Land, which is an interesting story because I think it went over like a year or two in the comics, and it involved all the Batman characters. And it was essentially about Gotham had been destroyed in an earthquake. Mm-hmm. And the federal government decided, you know what, Gotham experiences so many disasters, we don't want to rebuild it. We're not going to spend the money rebuilding the city. So they declare the city a federal no man's land. And they give people, I think, about a month to get out before they cut off the city from the United States. Because Gotham is on an island like Manhattan. Yeah. And so they're just like, we're going to blow all the bridges, mine the river, and if you don't get out, you're stuck there. And so a lot of people, for whatever reason, didn't leave the city. Either they didn't have the resources to leave, they were poor, they were doggedly determined to stay in their homes. But then also a lot of the criminals remained. And so what happens is that Batman and a few of the police who remain take back the city from the criminals and supervillains block by block. And it's this really epic story. And it has a lot of cool side stories. And one of those side stories involves the Huntress, who's a very interesting character because the Huntress, Helena Bertinelli, is a practicing Catholic superhero. And you actually you get to meet her confessor over the course of the story, who actually knows that she's the Huntress.
Yeah, and I didn't know that the Huntress was Catholic. I didn't know that before I read your article. And is she in this story? Is she Batman's daughter or no?
No, that is a different version. That's the Helena Wayne version.
Okay, got it. Okay, yeah.
No, this actually she is the daughter of a mob boss. Okay. Who was killed in a hit. And so she is, completely rejected that life of crime and tries to help the downtrodden and fight organized crime and stuff.
Okay.
But in this particular story, so a lot of the Catholic priests have also remained in the city, and they've set up a mission for the homeless. And this mission is infiltrated by the Scarecrow. And he starts to create a kind of grand social experiment where he tries to pit the different groups of refugees against each other based on religion or socioeconomic status or something like that. He contrives things so that the mission ends up, becoming infiltrated by more criminals. And what's fascinating about that story is that towards the end, when the situation is diffused, it's revealed that the Scarecrow was kind of behind all this. And in essentially a lynch mob forms to kill the Scarecrow. And the Huntress diffuses the situation by essentially telling the people, urging them to forgive him for what he's done.
Yeah.
She's like, look, this guy is really pathetic. He doesn't know love. He's never experienced anything like companionship or compassion in his life. He's used fear to turn you against each other, But don't, essentially, if you kill him now, you'd be doing exactly what he wants you to do.
Yeah.
And so the people actually end up forgiving the Scarecrow. Some of the religious members of the crowd tell him that he should seek repentance, that Jesus will save him, and that God loves him. The Scarecrow flips out because he doesn't want any of this.
Yeah.
He completely rejects the forgiveness of these people. In fact, it drives him a little bit crazy.
Yeah. That
his social experiment has ended in the people offering him forgiveness. He even starts to lose his sense of identity as the Scarecrow.
Oh, no.
But I just thought that story, a lot of the stories I like to explore in my nonfiction writing are stories about nonviolent conflict resolution.
Yeah.
About forgiveness, about compassion, about enemy love.
Yeah.
To love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. And and that story, that side story, by the way, is called Fear of Faith. I think it's 3 issues long.
Okay.
And it's part of the greater Batman No Man's Land story arc.
That's really cool.
Yeah,
I never really pictured the Huntress as a nonviolent character, I guess.
She's not, but in that situation, she is.
That's interesting. Yeah, I did not know she was Catholic. That's also interesting until I read your article. But with a name like Bertinelli, she's Italian, so probably, yeah.
Right. You'll also notice that the Huntress often wears a cross around her neck, even when in costume.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't notice that. I think there's a picture at the top here. I'm looking at it now. I don't see it. Her hair's in the way. Oh, cool. Yeah. I really enjoyed that article. I had not read No Man's Land, but I might have to now. Yeah.
It's about 4 or 5 volumes long in trade paperback.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty long. Cool. So, any final thoughts?
Just that I'm not giving up on comics yet. That's what I'll say. We've dumped a lot on modern day comics today, but I think my work over the last 2 years has shown that there's still some interesting little tidbits that we can glean, these seeds of the gospel, and I think that it's wrong there's a temptation to kind of just reject everything that is put out by the culture. Mm-hmm. I know it's fashionable to say that, like, oh, the MCU is trash and it's just garbage. I recently heard someone say that, like, the MCU is throwaway culture. And I'm like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? But in any case, like, I think it's more fruitful to have a dialogue comic book culture because of the MCU, comic books are more in the public consciousness now than they've ever been, even if the sales of the actual books are down.
Right.
these characters are more in the public consciousness than they've ever been. And I think it's more fruitful for those of us who work in evangelization or who work in apologetics or spreading the faith, that to dialogue with the popular culture, to not just dump on things people like, to say, oh yeah, no, there's actually something there that's interesting.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, use it as a non-threatening way to begin these discussions with people. And, you know, I wouldn't write about this stuff if I wasn't a fan of it.
Right.
You know,
and I think that's part of it, too.
If I weren't a fan of these characters, you know.
You kind of have to be, you have to like it already, you know, in order to engage with it and use it for apologetics. You kind of have to be a fan of it already. You know, you can't just, you know, I'm going to pick up this Batman comic and then I'm going to, you know, talk about, you know, how it's a seed of the faith or whatever, you know, if you've never even touched Batman before. And so I forget what saint it was. What was his name? He said you need to love what they love. You know, if you're going to, you know, try to reach people with the gospel, you need to love what they love. So I can't remember his name now. But he started this boarding school for boys. And he'd play soccer with them, you know, and he did magic tricks and stuff like that.
Oh, was it John Bosco?
Thank you, John Bosco. Yeah, it was Saint John Bosco. You need to love what they love, right? So you have to love these comics. Not all of them, obviously. We dumped on a lot of the modern ones, and there's a lot of problems with the storytelling. But like some of those, you know, it's funny because a lot of the older comic book lovers will tell you the same thing. They don't like the newer stories either, you know, and they might not be Christian at all. Like I remember talking to one guy at Half Price Books. He worked there, and I was, you know, getting rid of a bunch of comics that I, you know, some of the newer ones are just ones I didn't want to have anymore. And he gave me the price back of what he'll take for them, and I'm like, this isn't hardly anything, you know. But 10 years ago when I brought some, you know, I got a bunch of money for it. And he's like, oh yeah, they don't sell as much now that Disney bought, you know, Marvel, and nobody wants to read them anymore. And this is just an employee. He was an older guy. He was just the employee at Half Price Books. And even like those older, you know, the older generation of people who might not even be Christians, or conservative in any stretch, they say the same thing, right? So there is some common ground even among the older generation of people, that some of these stories have lost the plot, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but they do. You need to love what they love, you know, if you're going to use these stories that way. And I think you have to love them for what they are in a lot of these cases. So if you think superheroes are dumb, if you think the Marvel movies are a waste of time, then, you know, fine. You don't, you know, you're not going to use that then to you know, reach people. You know, that's fine. You don't have to love them. I think they're fun, but they're not high art. They're not like, you know, Bach or whatever. They're not Martin Scorsese films. So, but it's fine. You need high and low art to, you know, to have a full, an enriched palette, I guess. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling now.
Yeah, no, I think that, like, you know, with comic books especially, you know, when they focus on good art, when they focus on solid storytelling, on building characters that you can get behind, they're successful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like getting back to Ray Bradbury for a second, he says in a lecture he gave in 2001, I don't write stories to benefit the world. Mm-hmm. If they do benefit the world, great. But that's not what I set out to do. Whereas a lot of these modern writers are writing stories to quote-unquote benefit the world. They're trying to push an agenda or a message or whatever it is. But a good story and solid characters need to come first.
Mm-hmm.
Before you can even think of putting in all that subtext.
Right.
You know? And that goes for any kind of literature, really, not just comic books.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, any kind of, you know, narrative art, whether it's novels or movies or what, comic books, what have you. Like, you know, the story and characters need to come first. And like I said, I found that the most fun I've had in comics in recent years are just these kind of, that just focus on being fun and telling, you know, amazing stories about characters that you love and you can get behind.
Yeah.
And I think there needs to be more of that. And hopefully we'll start to see more of that as the indie scene grows.
Yeah.
But I guess my final message is that I'm still hopeful. You know, I'm not currently buying new DC and Marvel stuff right now, but you know, I'm hopeful that the industry may start to turn around eventually. But you know,
or they'll go out of business and be replaced by 1,000 small comic book companies.
Right. But I think the culture needs to shift first.
Yeah.
Because, like we said, it's kind of a feedback loop, right? So. Yeah,
I think that's a good note to end on.
Yes. Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, thank you, Thomas, for coming on my show. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Aaron. It's been a blast. As you can tell, I can talk about this stuff ad nauseum. So, but I've just had a lot of fun.
Great. Well, yeah, we'll have to have you on to talk about Ray Bradbury some more. I want to talk. I got to read more of his stuff. I got a big, huge pile of his books, but I got a lot of other books to get through.
I know what you mean. My nightstand here is groaning under the huge pile of books on it.
Yeah, so. That's a common problem. All right. Well, thanks for coming on, man. It's been fun.
Thank you so much, Aaron.
Hey, everybody. This is Aaron. I did it again. I forgot to ask the guest if they believed in fairies or not. So I sent a message to Thomas sometime after the interview. I asked him the question, and this is what he said. Do I believe in fairies? It's an interesting question. On the one hand, my scientific background urges me to be skeptical of such a notion. But on the other hand, I can't entirely rule out the possibility. I've learned that every time we think we understand the universe and its creatures, some new discovery upends our neat little paradigms. I'm in firm agreement with Shakespeare in such matters. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. We know that God has created a vast multitude of physical creatures just on this one planet. It's entirely possible that God also created an unguessable variety of spiritual creatures apart from the angels, who may sometimes interact with humans. In addition, if higher dimensions or alternate universes exist, we have no idea what visitors from such realities would be like. Perhaps people earlier in history called them fairies. It's a fascinating thing to ponder. In conclusion, I'd love to believe in fairies, but I remain an agnostic on this question. Perhaps the final answer only awaits future discoveries. Thank you for listening to this episode of I Might Believe in Fairies. Please leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. Please follow me on Twitter at Aaron Erber and like me on Facebook. If you're excited to see where the podcast is going and want to offer some support for the project, you can find me on Patreon. Music is by Alexander Nakarada, and podcast art was designed by my wonderful sister-in-law, Linnea Kisby. Until next time, talk to you soon.